Morning, church. What's the age on the junior church, Kath? Fifth grade? So if you're fifth grade and under, you're welcome to go with some of the adults. You're welcome to do that. You don't have to. You're welcome to stay right where you are, too. So today, we're going to look at the life of a man who's listed in Hebrews 11, which is this hall of fame of faith that we've been looking at. But actually, we need to go back to Judges chapter 13 to really look at his story. And from this, we're going to look and discover how to be a stronger person. Because we all admire strong people, right? Because strong people are people who seem just to have it all together. They don't crumble in a crisis. Instead, they're calm. They know how to hang in there. And it seems like they got everything under control. Everybody wants to be a stronger person. But you know, it's possible to be strong physically and to be weak spiritually. And we see here just an example in the life of Samson. I'm sure that's somebody that we've all heard about him, right? Samson was the strongest man who ever lived physically. But spiritually and emotionally, he was a weakling. Peter Drucker, in his book, The Effective Executive, says that every time you meet a person with great strengths, they also have great weaknesses. Samson illustrates that point perfectly. We all know, we've all heard about celebrities and athletes and public figures who, although they just had tremendous strengths, they also had a flaw in their character, a weakness that ultimately was their downfall. In spite of the fact that they were very strong, they let one little weakness destroy their lives. And today we're going to look at Samson's life. In Judges 13:24, it says, "The woman gave birth to a boy and named him Samson, and he grew. And the Lord blessed him." You see, right from his birth, this is a special child. Samson was raised in a godly home, and the Lord blessed him. As a young man, he took a Nazirite vow, which meant it was a vow of complete dedication to God. But when he became a teenager, that's a crucial years, right? When he became a teenager, he rebelled and he went his own way. And he didn't know what was happening in his life. And before he knew it, he had lost everything. In Samson's life, we see three things to avoid. Three characteristics that will weaken your life. Three things in Samson's lifestyle that sapped his strength. And I think we need to understand these things if we want to be a stronger person. And the first thing we need to learn from Samson is that self-indulgence will weaken your life. I'm talking about a lack of self-control. I'm talking about undisciplined living. Anything that is left uncontrolled in your life will weaken you. It could be how you spend your money. It could be sex. It could be food. It could be alcohol. It could be your emotions. It could be the way you manage your time. Anything that's left out of control, it will weaken your life. You know, everybody has, their pet indulgence, things that we kind of like to give into. We all have a weak spot. And it's no secret that Samson had a weakness for women. No doubt about it. He was the playboy of the Bible. In 3 chapters here in the book of Judges, he has 3 different women. His life is a pathetic cycle. He never learned the lesson. He falls into one trap after another. Chapter 14, we find the very first encounter. This is what it says, chapter 14. Samson went down to Timnah, and he saw a young Philistine woman. And that just means that she was non-Jewish. She was from another nation, right? And he says, when he returned, he said to his father and mother, I've seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as a wife. That's his philosophy. Get her. Just get her. His father and mother replied, isn't there an acceptable woman among your own relatives, your own people? Must you go to an uncircumcised Philistine to get a wife? But Samson said to his father, get her for me. She's the right one for me. And in the Hebrew, it literally says, get her for me because she pleases me. A modern day translation would be, get her for me because she turns me on. That's the way Samson lived his life. Self-indulgence. All he considered was his own pleasure. She pleases me. It didn't matter that God had said, don't marry an unbeliever. It didn't even matter that he had made a vow. He had made a promise that he would not marry an unbeliever. It didn't matter that his parents were saying, you're looking for trouble, that this is a dead-end road. Don't go down it. No, he just said, she turns me on. She pleases me. I want her. He was self-indulgent. I've got to have her. You know, our typical excuse for self-indulgence, no matter what it is, it's this attitude. Just one time. It can't hurt to try this one time. You know, and Satan's favorite rationalization is, it's just a little thing. It's just a small thing. But the truth is that small things can have an enormous impact on your life. Let's say you're taking a cruise, you know, and the boat pulls out about 50 yards from the shore, and then the captain comes on the speaker and he says, oh, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, I didn't want to upset you. So I waited until we pulled away from the shore, but this boat has a leak in it. Oh, don't worry, because it's just one leak, and it's not very big. It's a small leak. So we're going to go ahead and continue with the cruise. If you were smart, you'd say, hey, just drop me off on the shore, please, before we get out into the Atlantic, or before we get out into the Pacific. Because a little leak can sink a ship. Just like a big one can. When you have a leak is a leak. It doesn't really matter what size it is. Then the only question becomes the timing of it, right? It's going to sink the ship if you don't fill the leak. And for us, it's how do we handle these little things in our life? Samson ignored them, and it became just a question of time. Galatians 6 in the Living Bible says, don't be misled. Remember that you cannot ignore God and get away with it. A man will always reap just the kind of crop he sows. If he sows to please his own desires, he will be planting seeds of evil and will surely reap a harvest of spiritual decay and death. That's the way a lot of people are about the little things in life. But the application is, it doesn't matter any difference what area of your life is out of control. If it's time or money or food or sex or attitude, whatever. It doesn't matter. It will inevitably sink your ship if you don't take care of it. It will weaken you spiritually. So what's the lesson out of Samson's life? The first lesson to learn is this: strong people discipline their desires. They don't just let it all hang out. They don't just say, well, it's only a little thing. It doesn't really matter. I got everything else in my life under control. I can just have one little weak area, one little pet sin. No, strong people discipline their desires. Proverbs 25:28 says, anyone who lacks self-control is like a city whose walls are broken down. Meaning that the person who has no control in his life is defenseless. The protective walls are broken down. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6:12, everything is permissible, but I will not let anything master me. Samson's strength was sapped away. He was weakened by self-indulgence. Sin had mastered him. The second thing we see in Samson's life, it's in the next chapter. Each chapter in his life illustrates a different problem. And the second thing that we learn from Samson is that bitterness will also weaken your life. When you look at Samson, you see very quickly that Samson's in a constant state of resentment and anger. He's always upset about something. He's always acting or reacting violently to people. I mean, he had really a bad temper. And his primary motivation in life was simply to get even, to get revenge. No one's going to push me around. The last few verses of chapter 14, it says he burned with anger. Burned. And it says he went out and he killed 30 men just for their clothes. Now that's what I call a hot temper. Knocked off 30 guys for their clothing. He burned with anger. In chapter 15, we see this several times. In verse 3, Samson said, this time I have a right to get even with the Philistines. Verse 7, Samson said, since you acted this way, I will not stop until I get my revenge on you. Then he made the typical excuse of a weak person in verse 11. He said, I merely did to them what they did to me. That was Samson's modus operandi. He said, I'm going to live for my own desires, and he was always reacting to people. When you spend your life reacting to people instead of making your own decisions, your own choices, it will weaken your life. He was very bitter. I merely did to them what they did to me. They hurt me first. You ever make that excuse? Me and my sister constantly when we were kids. She did it to me first. We do it as adults too. Right? But when you use that it's just going to weaken your life. When you think about it, resentment, getting even, is just a waste. It's a waste of time, it's a waste of energy, and it's a waste of creativity. I mean, the whole time that you're mad, the person that you're upset towards is normally just totally oblivious to it. It's not bothering them one bit. Resentment always hurts you more than anyone else. Besides that, you spend all of your energy getting upset, getting emotional, getting disturbed. You get depressed, you get fatigued, you run out of energy, and you're just tired all the time. But really, the worst thing about getting even is that it's a waste of creativity. Because most of us, when we are angry at somebody, we become extremely creative, thinking of the ways we can get back at them. We start plotting, we start planning. I mean, we become geniuses on how to get even with somebody. And when you look at Samson's life, you have to admit, this guy was pretty creative at getting even. Chapter 15, verse 3, it says, Samson said to them, this time I have a right to get even with the Philistines. I will really harm them. So he went out. He caught 300 foxes, tied them tail to tail in pairs. Then he fastened a torch to each pair of tails. He lit the torches and let the foxes loose, standing in the grain of the Philistines. And he burned up all the stock, all the standing grain, together with the vineyards and the olive groves. Now, I'd say that's pretty creative. I mean, I never would have thought of doing anything like that. But he ruined their whole life. He ruined all their food, just destroyed it all. Pretty creative. In verses 14 to 15, the Philistine army was coming out to fight against them. And he looked around. It says he looked around and finding the fresh jawbone of a donkey, he grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men. That's pretty creative. It's a pretty creative tool to use. I heard about a church lady who asked another lady, does God ever use the jawbone of a donkey today? And the other lady said, our church uses one every Sunday morning. No amens. I don't want to hear any amens. But the fact is, when you get angry, when you get resentful, you're just wasting your time. You're wasting your energy, and you're wasting your creativity. If you use the same amount of those things that you use on getting revenge or getting even on something important, you'd be so much farther ahead. But bitterness and anger weakens your life. What's the lesson out of Samson's life? And that is, strong people restrain their reactions. Just like they discipline their desires, they restrain their reactions. They choose to act rather than react. They choose where they're going to go rather than continually reacting against the critics. Proverbs 29:22 says, a hot-tempered man starts fights and gets into all kinds of trouble. Isn't that the truth? Temper will always get you into trouble. Proverbs 16:32 says, it's better to be slow-tempered than to be famous, and to have self-control than to control an army. You could almost summarize Samson's life with one word: uncontrolled. He was uncontrolled in his sex drive. He was uncontrolled in his anger. Proverbs 29:11 says, a fool gives full vent to his anger, but a man of understanding, a wise person, controls himself. Keeps himself under control. Bitterness and anger will weaken your life. Self-indulgence will weaken your life. And the third lesson that we learn from Samson is that carelessness will also weaken your life. When you look at Samson, he was a very careless person. His strength was a gift from God. It wasn't from himself. It was from God. But he continually misused it, continually abused it. He was careless. You know, this power that he had, this strength that he had, came as a result of the commitment that he made to God when he was a young boy. Samson took a vow called the Nazirite vow, which including, among other things, it meant that he was going to have no alcohol whatsoever, that he'd be on a special kind of diet, and he made a vow to never cut his hair. Now, never cutting his hair was just to remind him that, Samson, you're different. You're totally dedicated to God. It was to say that my life is to be completely for God. And as a result, I'm to live differently. No alcohol, a certain kind of diet, total dedication to God. And so the strength of Samson was really not in his hair. The strength of Samson was in his commitment. And the hair represented that commitment. The hair represented the vow that he made as a young man, saying, God, I'm gonna live for you. But the problem in Samson's life was he forgot his vow. He sold out. He compromised. He gave in, and he broke his vows. The biggest mistake in Samson's life is that he refused to take himself seriously. He refused to take God seriously. I mean, it's a major problem. It will weaken your life. Samson thought everything was just a big game. I mean, he was a playboy. It was all about just having fun. He had a good time. But he was irresponsible. He toyed with temptation. It was like, how close can I get to the fire without it burning me? Or how close can I walk on the edge of the cliff and not fall off? He was constantly playing that way. I won't get hurt. There won't be consequences. And we use the excuse that somehow it'll be different for me. It won't happen to me. I'm better than that. I'm too strong for that to happen to me. This is seen with Samson's relationship with Delilah in chapter 16. Chapter 16 is that famous story that you all know about, the barbershop episode in Samson's life. See, the Philistines came to Delilah and said, if you'll find out the secret of the strength of your husband, we'll pay you 1,000 shekels. That's about $25,000 in today's money. That's a good amount of money. And Delilah was a treacherous person, and she said, I'll take it. And she tried to find out Samson's secret. And Samson just teased her. She tried 4 times. In chapter 16, in verse 4, it tells us all about it. Delilah said to Samson, tell me the secret of your great strength. And Samson just played along with her, just played a game with her. He said, if you bind me with 7 fresh bow strings, that have never been dried, he says, then I'll be as weak as anybody else. And so she puts him to bed. He has the men come in. They bind him with the bowstrings. And then she wakes him up and says, they're here. And they wake up and he sees all these enemies around him. He just breaks the strings and the party's over. But Delilah comes a second time back and says, you made me look foolish. Tell me again the secret of your strength. And Samson says, again, he's just playing. It's new ropes. Bind me with new ropes, and I'll never be strong again. I'll be as weak as anybody else. And then the same thing happens again. Now, you would begin to think that maybe Samson would catch on, right? He didn't have it all together. He wasn't too bright, right? Wouldn't you think that if your wife kept asking you the secret of your strength, and every night you wake up and there's strange men in your bedroom, wouldn't you think that something's wrong? I guess he had a lot of brawn, but very little brain. But really, to him, it was just a game. It was just a game. And he kept compromising a little bit of time. He kept pushing the limit. Because the next time he says, well, if you just weave my hair into 7 braids. See, he's getting closer to the actual truth, right? Because it does have something to do with his hair. He's skirting around the edge. He's playing with the fire. And he's having fun with her. He didn't take it seriously. He was careless. He was reckless. And finally, she says, this is the 3rd time you made a fool of me. You haven't told me the secret of your great strength. And I imagine that she turned on the tears. You know, somebody said a man is never weaker than when a woman is telling him how strong he is. That's so true in Samson's life. Verse 16 says, and with such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was tired to death. So he told her everything. And that was it. The problem in Samson's life is he compromised once too often. His lifestyle, truthfully, had been weakening him for years. I mean, the haircut episode was just the final straw. This didn't just happen overnight. His entire lifestyle was robbing him of the very strength that God had given him. But he didn't even know what was happening. He was clueless of the reality of the situation. And it's tragic what happened to him. Verse 19 says, having put him to sleep on her lap, she called a man to shave off the 7 braids of his hair, and so began to subdue him. And so his strength left him. Then she called, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And he woke from his sleep and thought, I'll go out as before and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. It's one of the most tragic statements in the entire Bible. He did not know that the Lord had left him. He was unaware of what was happening, how his lifestyle was perpetually weakening him little by little. He just assumed that he'd always be strong. You know, nobody ever plans for failure. It just comes on gradually. Nobody ever says, I'm going to plan on being an alcoholic. It comes little by little, one drink at a time. Nobody says, I'm going to grow up to be a drug addict. No, it comes on little by little. Somebody says, I never intended to destroy my marriage. But it starts with one little compromise until maybe it leads to an affair. Somebody says, I never intended to destroy my health. But it starts with not taking care of your body on a daily basis. It happens a little bit at a time. And it builds until at some point people wake up. And it's a rude awakening. And all of a sudden they say, what's happened? What's happened to my life? God's not there. What's happened? He left a long time back because they failed to take God seriously. What's the lesson we learned from Samson's life? Strong people keep their commitments. They protect them. They guard them. They are diligent. They don't let them go slack. They're not careless. They're serious about their relationship to the Lord. They're serious about their commitments. There's an old saying, and I know you've heard it before, that is, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. But let me just make another statement, that your life is only as strong as your weakest commitment. And if you have no commitment, you have no strength. The people who are the strongest are the people who have commitments and live and die by them. What are you committed to? Because that's where your strength comes from. Are you committed to the Lord? Are you committed to the church? Are you committed to your family? What are you committed to? Because Samson was only committed to one thing, himself. His attitude was, I'll do what I want to do when I want to do it, whenever I feel like it. If I see it, I'll take it. If I want a woman, I'll take her. If it feels good, I'll do it. His lifestyle was one of selfishness and immaturity. He had no commitments. It was a playboy idea of living for whatever he wanted to live for, totally undisciplined. And some people might call that freedom. But people who are undisciplined are really slaves. Discipline brings freedom. But when you're undisciplined, you're a slave to your own desires. And so strong people keep their commitments. And they're disciplined. There are a few other things that I've observed about Samson. One thing is that you never read that Samson prayed. He never prayed about anything. God was just an afterthought for him. Everything he did was all on his own. Is that a weak link in your life? Your chain is not any stronger than that weak link. And look at the tragic results. Verse 21 says, "Then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, took him down to Gaza, binding him with bronze shackles. They set him to grinding in the prison." Someone once observed that sin is binding, blinding, and grinding. And here, the champion of Israel becomes a clown, someone to make fun of. They put his eyes out, and he lost everything. He lost his power. He lost his potential. He lost his freedom. He lost his influence. He lost it all because he wasn't serious about the small things in his life. I mean, how is it that this guy who had so much potential ends up in such a tragic position? Because he was weakened by selfishness and bitterness and carelessness. Now, there's a warning here, no doubt. There's a warning. I hope you've all caught the warning. But I also want you to see that God never gave up on Samson. I mean, all the time he was doing his own thing, forgetting about God, living his own lifestyle. God never gave up on Samson. God gave him a second chance. Listen, there's hope. There's hope. Verse 22. "But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved." Remember, the hair did not represent his strength. The hair represented his commitment. And Samson in that prison, being blinded, bound, being used for what horses normally do, he had a lot of time to think. He had a lot of time to reflect on his life. And he had the ability to say, "Lord, I've blown it. I made a royal mess of my life." And his hair began to grow. His commitment to the Lord began to grow again. And he began to think, well, maybe, just maybe, God could give me a second chance. And the good news of the gospel is that God does give people a second chance. Samson came and he prayed. Here he prays. After everything is a mess, now he prays. And he repented and he got right and he recommitted his life to God. He started over and God began to build strength back into his life. His hair grew back. And Samson's greatest victory was on the last day of his life. It says they took Samson into the pagan temple to make fun of him. They put him between two pillars. But they didn't know that Samson had begun to pray again. They didn't know that Samson was getting right with God again, recommitting his life, getting back on the right track. And here Samson prays. He says, "Lord, in my last effort, let me avenge my enemies." And he began to push and strain with every ounce of muscle. And he pushed those pillars out, collapsing the ceiling above, killing 3,000 of his enemies. It was the greatest victory of his life. Now, but it also cost him his own life. But there's something comforting about Samson. Samson is mentioned in Hebrews 11. I mean, that's why we're looking at him, right? We've been looking several weeks at these heroes of the faith. But you would expect people like Abraham and Moses and Noah, you'd expect, these people we've looked at, you'd expect them to be in that list. But here's a guy who makes it in the Hall of Fame, who was an absolute failure in his life until his last days. Now that's comforting to me, because it says that no matter how much I've blown it in the past, no matter what a mess I've made in my life, God still says, you can start over. That's good news. Samson, on the last day of his life, did an act of faith that God says was worthy to be put into the hall of fame. And he's in there with David and Joseph and all these other great people of God. See, I don't care what you've done in your past. You may have blown it in all kinds of ways morally. And perhaps you're still haunted by those memories. You made a mess of your life financially or physically. You got addicted to something. You've had a broken marriage or 2 or 3. And you say, how could God ever use me? Listen, if God can use Samson, he can use you. It's a commitment. It's about recommitment. I have 3 questions that I'll ask and I'll be done. Just think about these questions. What is out of control in your life? Maybe it seems insignificant. Maybe you've been excusing it, maybe rationalizing it. Maybe nobody else even knows it's there. It's a secret. Nobody knows but you. Could be your appetite. Could be a moral temptation. Maybe some of you are having problems financially. Maybe you're having problems with your health. But every one of us, we all have weaknesses. We all got indulgence in. What's yours? What's out of control? Take inventory of it. It may be a little thing, but it will sink your boat. Question 2. Who are you resentful against? Who are you bitter about? Who is it that when you still think about them, it makes you angry? For your own sake, give that up. Don't be resentful. It's hurting you so much more than it's hurting the other person. Just like self-indulgence, bitterness will weaken your life. It drains the strength from you and prevents you from becoming a stronger person. Question 3. What are you committed to? I mean, are you taking God seriously? Or you just think God's a casual thing? I mean, that's a weakness that will eventually bear bitter fruit in your life. What are you committed to? We say, I've messed up my life so much, I don't think God could use me. I don't think God could ever love me. But that's why Samson's in the Hall of Fame. Samson was a royal mess, but at the end of his life, he made it. And if you would just make a commitment and just say, God, I don't know whether I have 5 days left to live or 500 days left to live or 50 years left to live. I want the rest of my life to be the best of my life. And I'm going to commit to you, lock, stock, and barrel. I'm going to commit to live for Jesus Christ. I'm going to be a committed Christian. I'm going to quit playing games. And God says, you've got a second chance. I don't know why you're here today. But no matter who you are, I believe that God has a purpose for you this morning. But it begins with a prayer. So I'm going to ask you to just bow your heads with me. Don't look around. Just bow your heads. And really focus in on your own heart. And I'm going to ask you just to pray this prayer in your own heart. Just pray, God, I know I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, and I ask you to forgive me. I do want to start over. Would you please just wipe the slate clean in my life? Please, Lord, forgive me and give me a clear conscience. And even as I ask for this forgiveness, I believe you give it to me. And Lord, maybe there's some people in my life that I need to forgive as well. So Lord, give me the strength to forgive them. Right now, by faith, I forgive them. I release them from ever having to get even with them again. Remove the bad feelings out of my life that makes me a bitter person. Help me be a better person. Help me to restrain my reactions. And Lord, help me to discipline my desires. Help me to keep my commitments. Jesus Christ, I want to commit my life to you right now. Please take the rest of my life, whatever it is, Lord, and use it for you. I want to live for you as best as I know how. And help me to guard that commitment and not to take my relationship with you carelessly. And thank you, Lord, for giving me another chance. And Lord, I thank you for these people who are here today and for the many who have just prayed that prayer in their heart and meant it. And even now, I'm sure that some people are feeling a mountain of guilt and regret sliding off their backs. It's such an amazing feeling to feel clean before you, to have a clear conscience. It's so refreshing to let go of old hurts and old wounds and to receive, to feel the fulfillment that comes from your forgiveness. So Lord, help us to keep our commitments to you. Help us to not be wishy-washy people, but to be serious about our spiritual walk with you. So Lord, help us all to be strong in our commitments to you. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.